Hello.
Hi, Tony, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. How
Somehow I'm
you
not hearing you.
not hearing me?
I may have to put on headphones. So I have my microphone plugged in. Hold on one second. Let's see. I'm still not hearing you, Tony. Can you
Yes,
hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. Great.
Terrific.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for doing the interview. Especially on short notice. I've been wanting
Oh,
to interview for many years actually, but thank goodness with Zoom, it makes it a lot easier to do these long distance interviews and have a good audio
mm-hmm.
quality recording, instead of just doing on the phone and doing
Sure,
a
sure. Well, I'm happy to join you. I should warn you that there is a thunderstorm going on right now, and so who knows what that's going to do.
I've got two hurricanes headed my way too, so
Oh yeah, you do, don't you? Oh
uh,
my goodness. I shouldn't complain. Never mind.
well, so far it's all some clouds. I don't think it's supposed to get this far anytime soon, but
Mhm.
anyway. I actually took a master class with you in South Carolina way back in 1988, I think it was 89 or 88, I think.
Uh-huh.
So
Okay.
and enjoyed it very much.
Oh, good. I'm
Uh,
glad. I'm glad to hear that.
uh,
Forgive me if I don't remember.
oh, well, I didn't have a mustache then, and Tony.
That's it. I knew you looked different. That was it. That was it.
Yeah, I didn't look like I belong holding up a stagecoach or anything.
Uh,
Okay. Let's see. Well, let's get right to it.
sure.
So you studied with Julian Bream in England on a Fulbright scholarship.
Mhm.
How did that come about, and what was that like?
Well, it came about, I should say that prior to the Fulbright, I had studied with Julian Bream in a master class in Stratford, Ontario in 1967. It was the first time he held that class. And I heard about the class through then his instrument maker, David Rubio, who I knew and would hang out in his shop down in Greenwich Village. And so I went to that class, and that was absolutely wonderful. And that was I mean, if you can imagine, I remember the first day, I was like sort of fifth or sixth in line to play, and the entire day I'm nervous wreck and I'm waiting to play, and just as it gets to me, he says, "Okay, well, that's it for today." So I had to play the next morning, which in any case, though, that class was great, and we kind of got hit it off because I remember playing ping pong with him, and then at a party, he wanted to play jazz, so I could back him up with chords while he did his Django Reinhardt thing.
Oh, how
And
cool!
yeah, it was very cool. I played, we had fun. And so then I saw him a few times after that in New York. And then he was giving a concert at the University of Connecticut a couple of years later, and I was the teacher there. So I drove him up from New York City with a friend of mine, Lenny Handler, and both of us, Julian Bream was just like God. And so to have the drive would normally have taken 2.5 hours, but with a thunderstorm then, it took 3 hours. So we had Julian Bream in a car for 3 hours. And you can imagine it was like the most incredible. Not only that, we had lunch with him. He said, let's get a bite to eat. And we went to this restaurant. And sitting at the restaurant was Fernando Valenti, and who's one of the greatest harpsichordists of all time. He says, "Oh, Fernando's over there," and so we had lunch with the two of them, the two giants of music. And then the ride up, and then we took him out to dinner. And then at a certain point in dinner, he said, "You boys do realize I have a concert, don't you?" And it was 7:45 for an 8 o'clock concert. And so we rushed him over to the hall to get his tux, and then afterwards it was a party. So the point of all this was that we spent a lot of time with him and got to, I can't say got to know him, but we were very on good terms. And so when the opportunity to do the Fulbright came up, I called, well, first of all, I saw him in New York and I talked to him about it. But then when it looked like it was happening, I called him and he said, well, yeah, sure, happy to do it. It was like a dream come true. Amazing, right? So I went over to England. Now this is 4 months later, 5 months later, and I called him up from London, and he said, well, hello, Fred, how are you? He says, what brings you to London? And I go, oh my God. He had forgotten. However, I have to say, after that, his touring schedule was incredible. He was away so much of the time. Sometimes he was only back for a couple of days, but he would give me, the lessons never stopped until I had no more music to play. And he would say, next time bring more music. So sometimes we'd have a 4 hour lesson. And I mean, what was it like? There are so many levels to address it, but the main thing I would say is, sure, we talked about specific technique and specific pieces and phrasing and all of that, but if I think of the one biggest thing that stands out, it was sitting next to him, listening to him play for that amount of time, and he would love to play for me too. He would say, "Oh, I'd like to run this by you. I have to play these pieces in a couple of weeks. I'm just learning them now." And that was the Walton Bagatelles. I mean,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. So just being so close to him and listening to him play, it was like, first of all, you hear that sound, and as important as the sound was, you hear what the standard is. This is the standard. And, on the one hand, it's a little deflating because, like, oh, how are you going to do that? But on the other hand, it was like, here it is. Come get it if you can.
Wow. What,
So,
what
yeah, and
else
it was
to
sort
know
of,
is how is it like playing ping pong with him? Who won?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that question. I'm gonna put it this way. I have a vicious forehand slam. I mean, it's really nasty. And at a certain point, I busted it out, and he didn't like that. All right. And he's very competitive, as am I. And at a certain point, a light went on in my head and said, "Do you want to slam him, or do you want to study with him? Which is more important here?" And I'm
Right.
not going to say anything more about
Right.
that ping pong game.
That's great.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was that, getting back to what you asked me, it was more like a transmission. He would play and I would just soak it in. And of course, there were specific things as well, technical advice and more, I would say more so. And this is where it comes down to what it is that I think is his greatest legacy. I think, and one could always argue this, he was the greatest musician to ever play the guitar. I don't know that that's really arguable, but I'm sure someone would take exception to it. But I don't mean to demean anyone else. But to me, he was the greatest musician to play the guitar. And most of what he talked about was that kind of thing, the architecture of a piece, the shape of it, the line, the phrasing, where does the phrase begin, where does it end? Very often not where you thought, or, where you had what seemed like the most obvious answer. He found hemiola's little rhythmical things that were just uncommon for most musicians to pick up, and that's what made his musicianship so alive. I think were these kinds of insights into the music, and he would very often run over the piano and play something and say, "This reminds me of something from this orchestral piece," and he's just a genius, flat out genius.
Well, you kind of touched on this a little bit. What was, since you spent so much time with him over such a long period, what was he like as a person?
Well, I should clarify first. Let's say that I did spend a lot of time with him comparative to other people. But with his touring schedule being what it was, I mean, when we got together, he said, "Look, I'm away for 4 weeks here and there." So I would have about one lesson a month. It came out to about 9 lessons during the time I was there. And as I said, the lessons sometimes were 4 hours long. But I just want to be clear about that. He was a hard guy to see. And I was so incredibly grateful for the time he gave me. He couldn't have been more generous. Now, you asked what was he like as a person. he's obviously incredibly witty and funny and has great stories. You know, he knew so much about music, but even when he knew something about something, he would prefer to tell it in a different way. Like I remember him talking about Lord Willoughby's Welcome Home, John Dowland lute piece, and if in private, you know, he was just an encyclopedia of information, but in the concert he said, well, not very much was known about Lord Willoughby, but evidently he wasn't home very much. And when he did come home, they made a big fuss.
Sounds
By the
like
way,
being
excuse my
great.
terrible British accent or impersonation, but anyway, you know, he was just very, very personable and totally lit up and engaging. On the other hand, I can't say that I ever really got to know him. I would say that on another level, he was very hard to. He didn't reveal himself, well, not to me. I wouldn't expect him to, but I would say that that was just a part of his who he was. You know, very private. So I
Very
got
great.
to see certain aspects of him.
Mhm. Okay. Um, well, how did your life as a musician, as a guitarist change after studying with Bream?
Great question. I was thinking about that, anticipating that you might ask me a question like that. And, you know, there are certain levels of, I mean, direct influence. Like, for instance, from the time I was 15 and I first heard his recordings, especially that first RCA recording with the Ravel and the, you know, Lennox Barkley and the Chimarosa, I just he just lit me up in a way that it just made me want to be that kind of musician. And not to mention, I should mention his lute playing. You know, he may have single-handedly started the re-interest in the Renaissance. I mean, he wasn't the only one, but he was so dynamic about it, and his like the Julian Bream consort and all those lute recordings and playing half the concert on lute. So that actually got my keen interest not so much in the lute, but in early music. And the way that manifests for me as a both as musician, improvising musician, and professionally is I wound up playing with some very premier Renaissance ensembles like the Waverly Consort and Calliope, and that connection with early music, which he's totally responsible for, eventually led me to the Metropolitan Opera, which seems like, well, what's the connection there? But they were doing an opera, this was in 1984, that required a lutenist. And I had been playing with a particular early music group where the head of the group, Calliope, was also an extra percussionist at the Met. And they said, well, who would we get to play the lute? And he recommended me. And was the beginning of, I'm still hold the chair of the Met as the lutenist and guitarist. I mostly do guitar, but occasionally lute. And so there was that, you know, direct connection. There was also, of course, the early part of my career touring and playing concerts, you know, playing a lot of early music. And I would say that a good part of my interpretations early on, and maybe not so early on, was so heavily influenced by him that in a way I was struggling not to just be him. You know, I certainly at a certain point I wanted to be him. And I remember coming back briefly during the Fulbright. I had to play some concerts in New York, and I came back with a slight English accent. And my friends, and I'm from Brooklyn, you know, so my friends kind of they said, "Whoa, buddy, that ain't you." So I had to struggle to find my own, you know, who I was as a musician, away from the Julian Bream orbit because he was so powerful in my life.
Mhm.
And eventually I did, not so much in my playing, because I still feel he's so heavily influenced my use of tone color and ponticello and, you know, the kinds of sounds that he would make. But I found my own voice as a composer, and that became more of what I did, playing my own compositions. But his influence on my musical career and my musical development, I can't even begin to say how it was everything really. Even I thought, well, surely there were some things I did that were independent of Julian Bream, you know. So for 15 years I wrote music for soap operas like As the World Turns and One
Oh, I
Life
did
to
not know
Live,
that.
Guiding Light. I did 5 different shows. They're all Procter and Gamble shows,
Wow.
and Yeah, and I thought, well, okay, well, that's mine. I
Wow,
did
that's
that.
pretty cool.
Yeah, that was great because I love to improvise, and here I could sit with my guitar in the country and improvise, and I just would send it to them, and they would play it as background music. It was a fantastic gig. But
Wow.
how did I get that gig? Well, let me think. I got that gig because I became friendly with Gene Bertoncini, legendary jazz guitarist. Well, Gene's life was completely altered by that same recording of The Art of Julian Bream on RCA. He heard the Ravel Pavane. He said, I just want to play that instrument forever. So he developed a keen interest in the classical guitar. And I remember when I was a student, I used to play these dinner parties, and Gene was a guest at the party, and but I didn't know him. I didn't know who he was, and he kept moving closer and closer as I was playing Bach Preve Fuga Allegro, and finally he was sitting down next to me, and he introduced himself, and we became friends. And then and he was doing a ton of studio work. So when As the World called him and they said, "Well, we need 3 hours of Spanish guitar music," he said, "Well, I don't really do that, but I know somebody," and
Wow.
that led to a 15-year career.
That is awesome.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
well, this
So I
means,
hope I answered the question at least somewhat about how much of an
oh yeah,
influence he
yeah.
had on me.
Well, you did that and more. Now you've written and already recorded a piece in homage to Bream. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think I wrote to you that in I forget what year it was, but it was Bream's 75th birthday. Benjamin Verdery, a very close friend of mine, is curator of the guitar series at the 92nd Street Y in New York City, a wonderful series. And he decided to hold a tribute concert for Julian Bream. And I hope I don't leave anyone else. So it was Ben, myself, David Leisner, David Tannenbaum, Scott Tennant, and William Cannengeiser. We were the players. And I was to do the opening lute segment. So I did that, but I decided I wanted to write a piece for the occasion for him. And I wanted the piece to kind of be a musical representation of both his early music persona, and that's why I have a lot of, if you hear the piece, a lot of those Dowland
Yeah,
cadence
yeah, yeah.
type things, uh, but also his incredible contribution to the guitars of contemporary music. And although my music is not contemporary in an abstract way, it is sort of contemporary in the tradition of, let's say, my influences are Samuel Barber and Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein. And so I have a lot of harmonies built in fourths that have a little more modern sound, and time meters in 5 and 7. So it was those two aspects that I wanted to represent in the piece. And I performed it on the 8 course Renaissance lute, but it occurred to me after the concert that that would probably be the first and last time that piece was ever going to be played unless I transcribed it for the guitar, which was very easy to do. It's just basically lowering the E to D and putting the G to F sharp, and I was all set. So
Mhm.
that's how that came about.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Oh, I wanted to ask you, since I have you here already, uh, I was I've aired on the show your Psalm of Thanksgiving like every year on my Thanksgiving show.
Oh, thank you for doing that.
Um, could you talk for flute and guitar? Could you talk a little about that one? It's in two sections.
Sure. I'm trying to think of when it was about in the 90s, the early 90s. I joined a group. It was a philosophy school. It's still there. It's called the School of Practical Philosophy. They have schools all over the world, and it's a school that draws from all traditions, of philosophy, Eastern, Western. And I was part of a composers group, and we were given an assignment, and we were given a text. And the assignment was to read the text, and then without any thought, like, what does this mean? Just read it, let it wash over you, and then compose. And I was given Psalm 100 from the Old Testament, and I think I can remember it's the first line, but the very important line is "Make a joyful noise." So that's what da dum ba dum ba da 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 dum, and and then there, as you read through it, there were certain lines that stood out that you wanted to have a musical embodiment of what that was. And that's really kind of the way I tend to work anyway. I try to avoid thinking about stuff too much when I'm writing, because whenever I do, I mean, I find there's a point at which, you just write spontaneously and intuitively, and then you start thinking about it, and you say, well, I use this here, maybe I'll do this, I'll invert the theme, all that. And then the next day when I come back and look at it, I say I like it up to a certain point, and it's always that point where I started thinking about it, and the intellect got involved. It's not to say that the intellect isn't important, but it's sort of, analysis can happen in retrospect, but during the act. So that was the point of the composers group, was to take a text and just to create, and that's how that song came about.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you also, solo guitar piece that I've enjoyed. Well, I used to play it, a trilogy that has the great written out jazz bass solo
Right, right.
in it. So, which for a non-jazz playing classical nerd, it was so neat to be able to play a jazz bass line.
Right.
Talk a
Well,
little bit about that one, and I guess that's a third stream, I guess, as you would call it.
yeah, yeah, that was for me, a very important piece in that it got a lot of notice from people like in South America and all over, and kind of put me on the map, as a composer, at least in the guitar world. And at that time, and I could say to this day, if I had picked two of the most influential musicians in my life, it would be Julian Bream and the jazz pianist Bill Evans. And what I was really trying to do, when I was 18, I had to make a serious decision about, do I want to be a classical guitarist or a jazz guitarist? Because my love for jazz was as deep as classical. But the only thing was, I was much more advanced as a classical player, and I understood what would be involved in becoming a jazz player. It's a whole other world. It's like diving into an ocean, and I felt I couldn't do both, and I don't really know. Maybe somebody can, but I knew I couldn't do both and give it my all in each. And I was so far ahead in the classical world that I went there, but the jazz never left me, and I would still listen all the time to jazz, and it kind of started to express itself in my music. And when it came to trilogy, it was like, okay, let's just do it. Let's let it out. And so there's a lot of Bill Evans in there, especially like in the second movement. And in the latter movement, a lot of that, that
Hmm.
that's Dave Brubeck. That's the
Oh, okay, yeah,
influence
of
of
course, of
Dave
course.
Brubeck. But the jazz, but the bass,
Yeah,
that's Ron Carter. One of my favorite bass player, maybe of all time, is Ron Carter. Especially he does this thing, do do do, ba-da-dum, diddle-dum, So I don't know how he could do that on a bass, because it's like I am.
yeah, yeah, especially on bass,
Yeah, with those big thick strings.
Yeah.
So that was an expression of my jazz persona, where I finally let it out of the bag. And it was also, a time in my life, I was, around 30 years old. Um, it's a very muscular, I think that's the term people use, muscular piece, in that it really requires you to play all over the neck of the guitar rapidly.
Yeah,
And that was a time when, you had to show your stuff.
yeah, yeah. It's definitely got lots of heavy lifting moments in it for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for
Okay.
me too.
Well, hey, it's like Beethoven for a pianist. You can't over practice it. It's hard for everybody.
Absolutely,
Uh,
absolutely.
okay, well, we got some gold on tape or virtual tape here. Um, is there any final thoughts you had? Anything you'd like? Let me ask you this. How would
Yeah.
you like for like a general audience who maybe only heard a little bit about Julian Bream or perhaps are hearing about him for the first time, what would you like for a general radio audience to know about Julian Bream?
Well, I mean, we kind of really covered it in the things that we talked about, but let's go back and say, well, number one, the greatest musician to ever play the guitar, and I'm talking now about his expressivity, his use of his rhythmic vitality, his use of tone color, his understanding of the shape of the music. I mean, this is on a level that I think only he ever achieved. So you would be hearing something that was never done on the guitar before, in my opinion. Okay. I think in his playing you hear his humor as well. At times, especially the lively dances and his
Yeah.
rhythmic fun. I remember one time we were playing a Bach suite, and he said, "Yeah, you could play it this way. That's okay. That's how most people would do it. But check this out." And then he played, and then he found this cross rhythm going across the bar of triplets, a sequence, and all of a sudden, so you're going da da da, you're going. It was just so it's that kind of thing that I think is so identified with his style of play. But it's just you have to hear this guy. You just have to hear him. He's a wonder. And as I say, there's never been anyone like him, and maybe never again. So that's as much of a reason to hear him as any, I guess.
Yeah. Well, the same could be said about you, Fred Hand. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you,
It's a pleasure
thank you.
talking with you, and
It's
I
great to
enjoyed.
talk with you and finally, well, I was going to say it's great to talk with you and finally meet you, but evidently that boat has sailed. I've met you.
Well, it's totally forgettable. I was in a prison lineup of other guitarists waiting to play for you, so totally forgettable. But enjoyed your music and your recordings for years, and um, I really wish I'd have got. I tried to do an interview with Julian Bream way back in 2000 or 2001 and tried to set it up, but unfortunately that never happened. So he's one
Hmm.
of the few giants that I haven't gotten to talk to for the radio show. But I'm so glad to finally get you on
Oh,
Guitar
I'm
Live.
delighted to be asked. And I just wanted to mention one thing that, and you were very sweet to call me professor in emails, but of course, you call me Fred. But in terms of my professional name, I like to use Frederick.
Okay, Frederick.
Spelled without a K, by the way, because I don't know why, but that's the way it's spelled. People usually just add the K automatically.
Okay,
Um,
well, I'll do it that way on the radio show for sure.
sure. And I wanted to ask you also, do you need, I would love to send you any recordings you don't have. I asked my record company to send you like the newer recordings. I had one Odyssey, which actually has the Julian Bream thing on it, and also a newer one called Samatorea. I don't know if you ever received those, but,
I think I
Do
have
you have Jazz
Odyssey.
Antiqua?
I think I've Odyssey. I think I aired that one. I know I've aired annually for years that Psalm of Thanksgiving.
Psalm
Uh,
of Thanksgiving well, it's been on a few things, but
I,
it
I
was on the
actually
Odyssey
bought it
too.
when it came with a
The
piece of
music.
sheet music.
Yeah, yeah,
That
right,
was
right.
how I first got it, and that's probably.
Okay, okay.
And then
Do
I
you
think
have
I was
do you have
on.
Samaturea? That's the most
That
recent
sounds
one.
that sounds familiar. Does that have like Sephardic songs on it?
No, the Sephardic songs are on the Odyssey album.
Okay.
Samaturea has it actually even has some like it has the Brazil guitar duo. It's the first time I put out a record where I'm not playing the piece, but
Yeah.
I wrote a piece for the Brazil guitar duo, and I wrote a extended composition with the great flutist Paula Robeson.
Wow.
So I'll send
I'll
that to
have
you
to
then.
look at. I'm sure I'll find it or Google it or something.
Well, let me know if send me an email. Let me know if you have, because if you don't have it, I'd love for you to have that. And also, do you have Jazz Antiqua?
I used to. I think I had that on vinyl
Okay, I'm gonna send
many
you
years
that.
ago. But yeah.
Is it okay if I send you that? All right.
Yes, please, please.
Do you prefer the CD or just rip the MP3s
Just
off of it?
just send me the files. I had thousands of CDs, and when I moved,
Oh,
I
sure. Okay,
got
sure.
everything.
Okay, that's great. That's great. So just to make sure, is there anything you wanted to ask me that you didn't get to? Because
No, I made a list of everything, and we pretty much hit everything on it. So,
yeah.
but also now that we have Zoom, if we need to do an update, we can always.
I just thought of something that I didn't talk about.
Yeah.
And when you asked me the question about why one should listen to him
Mhm.
and what made him so special, uh, he was fearless. And when I say he was fearless, I mean he would finger things in such a way. It was always for a musical reason, but sometimes it would be he'd finger things way up high, and they were incredibly difficult and they were risky.
Mhm.
But he'd just go for it, and he wouldn't always make it. But even when he didn't make it, you knew what he was going for. And
Yeah.
it was like, oh man, I applaud you for going for that.
Yeah.
No. I remember, when sometimes he would say, "Oh no, take all the slurs out. Don't play any slurs there." And then he would do it, and it was like, "Oh God!" I said to him, "Yes, yes, maestro, of course." I would, no.
Yeah.
It was, he was not only fearless in the way that he fingered things, to always the music first, but also he was fearless. Like he would sit down and play modern music. He played the Henza Royal Winter music, and whether the audience liked it or they didn't like it, I'm going to do this. And you just have to tip your hat, to someone who's just so committed in that way that he wasn't concerned about the outcome. He was just like, this is what I have to say.
Yeah. True artist.
So yeah, I had to add that to it.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Those are great points. That's interesting because I just interviewed film composer Mark Mancina a couple hours ago, and he said he echoed your points. He said most musical guitarist, and he's fearless. So,
Oh, is that right? Well,
uh,
that's it. There you
yeah,
go.
yeah. Well, thanks again so much.
My
Been a
pleasure,
pleasure.
really.
I'll let you know when this airs. It's probably going to be late September, early October, I believe, because
Oh,
it's kind of
please
that
do.
time.
I'd love to hear it. I'd love to
Yeah,
hear it.
I'll absolutely send you a link.
Okay. Thanks so much. Be
Thank
well.
you so much. Pleasure.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.